He laughed, the entire boardroom erupting in mocking laughter when I mentioned my 2% stake, a tiny, seemingly meaningless fragment. But none of them knew that this insignificant piece would be the final blade to slash through his entire $200 million empire. This is a story about patience, humiliation, and the revenge I spent my entire youth preparing for. They thought 2% meant nothing. They were dead wrong. My name is Rebecca Moore, and at 34, I'd spent 12 years clawing my way up from a junior analyst position to senior financial analyst at Halberton Dynamics, a tech conglomerate worth hundreds of millions. The Ohio middle-class girl who'd eaten ramen for dinner 3 nights a week through college had finally made it to the gleaming 42nd floor of the Chicago headquarters. Or so I thought. That Thursday morning in March, the boardroom smelled of leather and arrogance. 23 shareholders sat around the massive mahogany table, their combined net worth probably exceeding the GDP of small nations. I sat near the end, clutching my portfolio, watching Richard Cole hold court at the head. Our CEO, 6'3", silver-haired, with the kind of tan that only comes from owning multiple vacation homes. Now, before we discuss the Q3 projections, Richard said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. I believe Ms. Moore had something she wanted to present regarding her concerns about our Asian market expansion. The way he said concerns made it sound like I was a child complaining about monsters under the bed. I stood, feeling 20 pairs of eyes dissecting me, my department store suit, my practical heels, my everything that screamed, "Doesn't belong here." Thank you, Mr. Cole. As a shareholder, I've analyzed our exposure in the semiconductor supply chain, and I believe— Excuse me, Richard interrupted, that practiced smile never leaving his face. When you say as a shareholder, could you remind everyone of your actual position here? My throat tightened. I own 2% of the company's shares. The laughter started as a chuckle from someone to my left, then spread like wildfire. Richard actually slapped the table, his Yale-class ring clicking against the wood. 2%, he announced to the room, as if I hadn't just said it myself. Ladies and gentlemen, our Ms. Moore here thinks her 2%, her tiny, microscopic slice, gives her the right to question strategies developed by those of us with actual skin in the game. Every shareholder has a voice, I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my cheeks. Of course, Richard said, still grinning. Just as every ant in the colony has a voice. But we don't let them steer the ship, do we? He turned to address the room. What's next? Should we poll the janitors about our merger strategies? Perhaps the parking attendants have thoughts on our IPO timeline. The room erupted. Even Margaret Zhao, who'd always been cordial to me in the elevators, was hiding her smile behind her hand. I stood there, papers trembling slightly in my grip, watching my credibility evaporate like morning dew under Richard's scorching mockery. Please, sit down, Rebecca, he said, using my first name like we were old friends, though he'd never addressed me as anything but Ms. Moore before. We'll make note that the owner of 2% has concerns. Betty, please add that to the minutes. In the footnotes, perhaps? His secretary actually typed something, the clicking keys adding percussion to my humiliation. I sat down, my face burning, my carefully prepared presentation now worthless. For the rest of the meeting, every time Richard made a point, he'd glance at me with mock concern. Unless our 2% stakeholder objects. More laughter, more knowing looks. When the meeting ended, I was the last to leave. Richard lingered by the door, adjusting his Hermes tie. No hard feelings, Moore, he said quietly. But you need to understand your place. 2% doesn't make you a player. It makes you a spectator with a slightly better seat. Don't forget that. As I walked back to my cubicle, yes, even senior analysts didn't rate offices at Halberton. My heels clicking on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. Each step was a second ticking towards something Richard Cole couldn't see coming. He thought he'd taught me about power that day. He thought he'd put me in my place. But what he'd actually done was light a fuse. 2% wasn't nothing. In the right hands, with the right leverage, 2% could be everything. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and created a new folder. I named it Goliath. Inside, I started my first document. Richard Cole, Weaknesses. The war had begun. He just didn't know it yet. The humiliation in that boardroom wasn't my first dance with Richard Cole's cruelty. No. Our history went back much further, though he'd never connected the dots. Why would he? The CEO of Halberton Dynamics had destroyed so many lives. My family was just another casualty in his spreadsheet of conquests. I was 11 when my father came home that Tuesday night in 2001, his face gray as ash. Mom was making meatloaf. I still remember the smell mixing with the acid scent of fear that suddenly filled our modest 2-story house in Dayton. They stole it, Linda, he'd said to my mother, collapsing into his worn recliner. Everything. The patent. The prototype. Everything. My father, Daniel Moore, had been a brilliant software engineer. For 3 years, he'd worked 18-hour days developing a revolutionary compression algorithm in our garage. He'd pitched it to various tech companies, hoping for a partnership. Young Halberton Dynamics, then just an aggressive startup, had seemed the most interested. Richard Cole, their newly appointed CEO at 35, had personally flown out to Ohio, shook my father's hand, and promised a fair deal. Instead, they'd used the evaluation period to reverse engineer his work, filed their own patents with minor modifications, and launched their product 6 months later. When my father tried to fight back, Halberton's legal team buried him in paperwork. The lawyer fees drained our savings, then our college funds, then forced a second mortgage on the house. I watched my father shrink into himself over the next 2 years. The man who'd taught me algebra at age 8, who'd stayed up helping me build science fair projects, became a ghost haunting our halls. He took a job at an electronics retail store, selling computers built with technology that should have made him millions. The house went into foreclosure when I was 14. I still remember the sheriff's notice on our door, the yellow paper that might as well have been a death certificate for my father's spirit. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment where the walls were so thin. I could hear him crying at night through the bedroom door. He died of a heart attack at 52. The doctors called it stress-related cardiomyopathy. I called it murder by paperwork. Mom worked 3 jobs to keep me in school. I studied like my life depended on it, because it did. Every A+ was a small revenge against the world that had crushed us. Every scholarship was a middle finger to Richard Cole, though he didn't know it yet. I chose finance deliberately. Not because I loved numbers, but because I needed to understand the language of power. While my classmates at Ohio State partied, I lived in the library, absorbing everything about corporate law, securities, hostile takeovers. My economics professor, Dr. Harrison, once asked why I worked so hard. "I'm studying for a war," I'd told him. He'd laughed, thinking it was a joke about corporate competition. But I was dead serious. After graduation, I took any job that would teach me about Halberton Dynamics. First, at their auditing firm, where I spent 2 years learning their financial patterns. Then at a consulting company that handled their restructuring, where I mapped their entire corporate structure in my spare time. Each position was a reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence for a battle no one knew was coming. When I finally joined Halberton itself 5 years ago, it was like entering enemy territory. I kept my head down, did exceptional work, and slowly accumulated shares through the employee purchase program, buying more whenever I could afford it, eating instant noodles to save money, wearing the same 5 suits on rotation. 2%. It had taken me everything to get to 2%. Richard Cole had no idea that the mousy analyst he'd humiliated was the daughter of Daniel Moore. I'd been careful to never mention my father, never reveal the connection. My personnel file showed Rebecca Moore from Ohio. Common enough name, unremarkable background. He'd probably forgotten my father's name anyway. Just another small inventor crushed under the wheels of progress. But I remembered everything, every tear my mother shed, every pill bottle by my father's bedside, every birthday without presents because the money went to lawyers, every dream deferred, every hope strangled. That night after the boardroom humiliation, I sat in my apartment, nicer than the one we'd been evicted to, but still modest by Halberton standards, and opened a box I kept under my bed. Inside were documents, my father's original patent applications, photographs of his prototype, letters from Richard Cole promising partnership, evidence of a theft that was too old to prosecute, but not too old for revenge. I picked up my father's engineering notebook, his handwriting still clear on the yellowed pages, and made a promise. I'm going to destroy him. Dad, with the very same attention to detail you taught me, line by line, dollar by dollar. The 2% wasn't just shares, it was a foothold, a beginning. And Richard Cole had just given me all the motivation I needed to begin. The weeks following the boardroom humiliation became my war room preparation. My cramped one-bedroom apartment transformed into a command center. The living room walls disappeared behind flowcharts, printed emails, financial statements dating back 15 years. Red string connected photos of board members to shell companies, offshore accounts to suspicious transactions. It looked like the lair of a conspiracy theorist, but every connection was real, documented, waiting. I barely slept. After my day job analyzing markets for Halberton, I'd return home and analyze Halberton itself. Coffee became my blood. My eyes burned from staring at screens, tracing money trails through Byzantine corporate structures Richard had built to hide his sins. The first breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Hidden in the footnotes of a 2018 acquisition report, I found it, a $15 million discrepancy disguised as consultancy fees paid to a firm in Delaware. The firm existed only on paper. Its sole director? Richard Cole's brother-in-law. But I needed more than suspicious transactions. I needed allies. That's when Marcus Hale entered my life. I found him at Finnegan's, a dive bar where broken corporate lawyers went to drown their shame. Marcus sat alone at the bar, nursing whiskey like medicine, his $1,000 suit wrinkled like his spirit. You defended Steinberg Industries against Halberton, I said, sliding onto the adjacent stool. He looked up, eyes bloodshot, and lost, spectacularly. Thanks for the reminder. You didn't lose because you were wrong. You lost because Richard Cole played dirty. Marcus laughed bitterly. Proving that would require evidence that conveniently disappeared from discovery. What if I told you it didn't disappear? What if someone saved copies? His hand stopped halfway to his glass. For the first time in our conversation, his eyes focused sharp. Who the hell are you? Someone who knows Richard Cole destroyed your career just like he destroyed my father's life. Someone with access. Someone with a plan. We talked until dawn. Marcus had been one of Chicago's most promising corporate attorneys until he'd gone against Halberton. Richard had not just won the case, but had made sure Marcus was blackballed from every major firm in the city. Now he worked personal injury cases from a strip mall office. Even if you have evidence, Marcus said, you can't fight him through normal channels. He owns judges, has politicians in his pocket. I don't want to fight him in court, I replied. I want to use the market against him, turn his own shareholders into weapons. But I need someone who understands the legal pressure points. Marcus studied me for a long moment. You're that analyst, the 2% girl he humiliated last month. The stories all over the Halberton gossip circuit. That's me. And you think your 2% means something? Not alone. But Richard's made enemies, lots of them. Small shareholders he's squeezed out. Board members he's betrayed. Investors who've lost millions on his failed promises. They just need someone to unite them. Over the next 3 months, Marcus and I built our network carefully. We met in coffee shops, libraries, anywhere but our offices. I provided the financial intelligence. He provided the legal framework for what would come. My day job gave me perfect cover. As a senior analyst, I had legitimate access to financial reports, merger documents, strategic plans. I photocopied everything, memorized patterns, identified weaknesses. Halberton's IT system was sophisticated, but they never suspected internal reconnaissance from a 2% nobody. The web grew. Former employees with axes to grind, journalists hungry for a real story, small investors who'd been burned. Each person thought they were my only contact, but I was orchestrating a symphony of discontent. Late one night, mapping cash flows through Halberton's subsidiaries, I found the smoking gun, a series of trades made with insider information, timed perfectly before major announcements. Richard had made millions while smaller shareholders lost everything. It was elegant in its corruption, hidden across 17 different transactions. But once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. "This is it," Marcus said when I showed him. "This could trigger an SEC investigation." "Not yet," I replied. "We leak this now. He'll find a scapegoat, pay a fine, move on. We need to make him vulnerable first, make him arrogant, make him overextend." "How?" I smiled, thinking of my father's patient engineering. "By feeding him exactly what he wants to hear, by making him believe he's invincible. Richard's greatest weakness isn't his corruption, it's his ego." I started planting seeds. Fake market research suggesting massive opportunities in sectors I knew were volatile. Whispered rumors about competitors' weaknesses that would make Richard pounce. Each move designed to make him stretch Halberton's resources thinner, make riskier bets, create more exposure. Meanwhile, I quietly reached out to other small shareholders, particularly those holding between 1% to 3% stakes. Individually, we were nothing. Together, we represented almost 18% of the company. Not enough for control, but enough to demand attention. The blueprint was complete. The players were in position. Richard Cole still saw me as the pathetic 2% analyst he'd crushed in his boardroom. He had no idea he was already trapped in a web that had taken me 3 months to spin. Thread by careful thread, the spider was ready to feast. The first domino fell on a humid September morning. The Financial Times ran a small piece on page 6. Questions arise about Halberton's accounting practices. The reporter, Sandra Kim, was one of my carefully cultivated contacts. I'd fed her just enough to spark curiosity, not enough to trace back to me. Richard dismissed it at the Monday meeting. "Slow news day," he laughed. "They'll print anything for clicks." But I watched the subtle shift in the room. Margaret Zhao checked her phone twice. David Brennan, our CFO, loosened his tie. Blood in the water, even if just a drop. That evening, I executed phase 2. Using a burner phone, I sent anonymous packages to 3 major institutional investors holding Halberton stock. Each package contained fragments of evidence, not enough to prove anything definitively, but enough to raise uncomfortable questions. A suspicious wire transfer here, an inflated asset valuation there. Within a week, BlackRock's representative called for an extraordinary audit. Vanguard started asking about specific line items in our quarterly reports. The questions were precise, surgical, because I'd told them exactly where to look. Richard's response was predictable, aggressive denial mixed with lavish distraction. He announced a massive expansion into South American markets, promising 40% returns within 2 years. The board, desperate to shift focus from the audit questions, approved his proposal. "He's doubling down," Marcus observed over coffee at our usual spot. "Just like you predicted." "Men like Richard can't admit weakness," I replied. "His ego won't let him play defense." Meanwhile, I leveraged my 2% stake for its real power: information access. As a shareholder, I could request detailed financial documents that regular employees couldn't touch. I spent nights photocopying, scanning, building an archive of evidence that would make Watergate look like a filing error. The journalism campaign intensified. I leaked to different reporters, always through different channels. TechCrunch questioned Halberton's inflated user metrics. The Wall Street Journal noted discrepancies in their Asia-Pacific revenues. Bloomberg highlighted unusual options trading patterns before major announcements. Each story was a paper cut, insignificant alone, but collectively bleeding Richard's credibility. The October shareholder meeting was electric with tension. Richard wore his usual armor of Armani confidence, but I noticed the new lines around his eyes, the way he gripped his Mont Blanc pen too tightly. These media attacks are coordinated, he announced, probably funded by our competitors. But Halberton is stronger than ever. Our South American expansion is already exceeding projections. Lie. I knew because I'd seen the real numbers. The expansion was hemorrhaging money, but Richard had hidden the losses through creative accounting that would make Enron blush. After the meeting, I made my move. I approached 3 small shareholders I'd been courting, owners of 1%, 1.5%, and 2.5% respectively. Check your portfolios tomorrow, I told them, then call me. That night, I had Marcus file a shareholder derivative lawsuit, not against Halberton, but specifically against Richard Cole for breach of fiduciary duty. With my 2% stake, I had standing to sue. It was a pinprick, legally speaking, but it gave me discovery rights. The next morning, Halberton's stock dropped 12%. The combination of media pressure, the lawsuit, and rumors about the South American disaster had finally spooked the market. My 3 shareholders called within hours, panic in their voices. We need to coordinate, I told them. Individually, we're nothing. Together, we're 7%. Enough to demand a special board meeting. They agreed immediately. Fear is a powerful motivator, but the masterpiece was yet to come. Through a chain of anonymous tips, I'd led a hungry journalist named Tom Bradley to a story about Richard's brother-in-law's consultancy firm. Tom didn't know I was his source. He thought he'd uncovered it himself through brilliant investigation. His article dropped on a Friday afternoon. Halberton's CEO funneled millions to relative's shell company. Documents show. The story included photos of contracts, wire transfers, emails, all documents I'd carefully placed in Tom's path over 6 weeks. Richard couldn't claim fake news when the evidence was right there in black and white. The SEC announced an investigation that same day. Richard called an emergency board meeting through the glass walls of the boardroom. I watched him rage, his face red as he gestured wildly at the assembled directors. But body language told the real story. Board members leaning away, arms crossed, the universal posture of distrust. That night, Marcus texted me, "He's vulnerable. Time for the kill shot." "Not yet," I replied. "He needs to feel the walls closing in. Desperate men make fatal mistakes." I planted one final piece of information with Sandra Kim. Richard was planning to flee to his Cayman Islands property, where he'd stashed millions in offshore accounts. The story was false, but Richard's paranoia would make it true. Sure enough, within days, airport security found $2 million in bearer bonds in Richard's luggage during what he'd claimed was a routine business trip to the Caribbean. The photos of him being escorted back through customs were front-page material. Now board members weren't just concerned, they were furious. He'd tried to run, making them all look guilty by association. My phone rang. Margaret Zhao, the board member who'd laughed at my 2% stake 6 months ago. "Rebecca," she said, her voice careful. "We need to talk about Richard. I think you might have insights we've overlooked." I smiled, looking at my wall of evidence, my carefully orchestrated campaign that had taken Halberton from a $200 million valuation to barely $80 million in 3 months. "I might have some thoughts," I said mildly. "Should I bring my 2% stake to the meeting?" Her pause was delicious. "Please do." The trap was set. The prey was wounded. Time for the spider to strike. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m. I arrived at 8:45 carrying a single leather portfolio. Inside, 23 pages that would end Richard Cole. The boardroom felt different. Gone was the casual arrogance, replaced by the sharp tension of survival. Margaret Zhao sat rigid. David Brennan sweated through his shirt. Other board members whispered in clusters, alliances shifting like sand. Richard entered last, still playing the emperor, but his kingdom was burning, and everyone could smell the smoke. "This witch hunt ends today," he declared, not bothering to sit. "I've led this company to unprecedented heights. One coordinated media campaign won't—" "Sit down, Richard." Margaret's voice cut through his bluster. "Rebecca Moore has something to present." Richard's eyes found me, And for the first time, I saw fear flicker across his face. The 2% analyst, this is ridiculous. The 2% shareholder, I corrected, standing, who uncovered 17 instances of insider trading, 43 fraudulent transactions, and a systematic embezzlement scheme totaling $37 million. The room went silent. I opened my portfolio, pulled out the first document. Exhibit A, on March 15, 2019, Mr. Cole purchased 50,000 shares of Quantum Dynamics through a proxy buyer in Singapore, 2 days before Halliburton announced its acquisition of the company. Profit, $3.2 million. Richard's face drained of color. You can't prove. Exhibit B, I continued, laying down another sheet. Email correspondence between Mr. Cole and the proxy buyer, obtained legally through discovery in my shareholder lawsuit. Marcus had worked magic with those discovery rights, finding threads Richard thought were buried forever. Exhibit C, Halliburton purchased technology patents from Shadowtech LLC for $15 million in 2020. Shadowtech's sole owner is Richard's brother-in-law. The patents were previously valued at $200,000 by independent assessors. Each page I laid down was another nail. Board members leaned forward, reading the evidence with growing horror. Exhibit D through K, a series of trades made by Mr. Cole's personal investment firm, Apex Holdings, that perfectly anticipated every major Halliburton announcement. Statistical probability of this being coincidence, 0.10003%. This is fabricated. Richard slammed his fist on the table. She's a nobody with a grudge. Exhibit L, I said calmly. Security footage from our own building showing Mr. Cole accessing the CFO's computer after hours on 9 separate occasions, each time before suspicious trades were made. David Brennan stood up. You accessed my computer? To frame me, Richard shouted. This is corporate espionage. I smiled. Exhibit M, Mr. Cole's signed confession. The room exploded. Richard went white. That's impossible. Not to these crimes, I clarified, but to the theft of intellectual property from Moore Technologies in 2001. The statute of limitations has passed for criminal prosecution, but civil liability remains. Estimated damages with interest, $47 million. I pulled out my father's original patent documents, his photo, the contracts Richard had signed and violated. Daniel Moore was my father. You destroyed him for an algorithm that made Halliburton its first $50 million. Now his daughter owns 2% of what you built on his bones. Board members were standing now, voices rising. Margaret Zhao was on her phone with legal. David Brennan looked ready to vomit. But I wasn't done. Exhibit N, a full forensic accounting report prepared by Ernst & Young, commissioned by a collective of shareholders representing 18% of this company. This was the knockout punch. My allied shareholders had pooled resources for an independent audit. The report was damning beyond Richard's worst nightmares. 300 pages detailing systematic fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement dating back 7 years, I summarized. The SEC has been provided a copy as of, I checked my watch, 17 minutes ago. Richard lunged across the table at me, but 2 board members held him back. His perfect composure finally shattered completely. You fucking bitch! You planned this. You've been planning this. For 6 months, I confirmed calmly. While you laughed at my 2%, I used it to destroy your empire. Every document request, every shareholder right, every piece of information my stake entitled me to. I used them all. Margaret Zhao stood. Motion to remove Richard Cole as CEO, effective immediately. Seconded, David Brennan said instantly. All in favor? Every hand went up except Richard's. Motion carried. Security entered. I'd made sure they were on standby. As they escorted Richard out, he turned back to me, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over. I'll destroy you. Mr. Cole? I interrupted. You already tried to destroy my family once. You failed. Because you forgot something important. 2% of something is infinitely more than 100% of nothing. And after the lawsuits, criminal charges, and asset seizures, nothing is exactly what you'll have. Marcus appeared in the doorway, flanked by FBI agents. Richard Cole, you're under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. As they read him his rights, I gathered my documents carefully, each page a moment of my father's vindication. Margaret Zhao approached me. Rebecca, we need someone who understands this company's finances. Would you consider? No, I said simply. I didn't do this to take his place. I did it to honor my father's memory. My work here is done. I walked past Richard as the agents cuffed him. Our eyes met one last time. 2%, I whispered. He looked away first. The collapse was spectacular, like watching a skyscraper implode in slow motion. Within 48 hours of Richard's arrest, Halberton Dynamics ceased to exist as we knew it. Friday morning, the SEC froze all of Richard's assets and launched a comprehensive audit of Halberton's entire operation. By noon, 3 more executives were arrested: the CFO, David Brennan, the head of acquisitions, and Richard's personal assistant who'd helped facilitate the offshore transfers. I stood in my apartment, watching the news coverage on 3 different screens. CNN ran the headline, "Tech giant Halberton crumbles amid massive fraud scandal." Fox Business showed Richard's perp walk on repeat. CNBC analyzed how the stock had dropped 78% in 2 days. My phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists wanting statements, former employees calling to thank me, board members begging me to help salvage something from the wreckage. I ignored them all. Saturday brought more revelations. The FBI found records of bribes to city officials, forged environmental assessments, and a second set of books hidden in Richard's home safe. Each discovery was another nail in a coffin already buried 6 feet under. Marcus called from his office, exhausted but exhilarated. "The FBI wants to give you a commendation. You did their job for them." "I don't want recognition," I told him. "I want to watch it burn." And burn it did. Monday morning. Halberton's biggest competitors circled like vultures. The patents, the technology, the client lists. Everything was being carved up and auctioned. The building itself, that gleaming tower where Richard had humiliated me, was seized as proceeds of crime. I returned one last time to clean out my desk. The 42nd floor was nearly empty. Those who remained looked shell-shocked, lost. They nodded at me with a mixture of respect and fear. I was the woman who'd killed Goliath with a pebble. In the lobby, a crowd of reporters waited. I pushed through them silently until one question stopped me. "Ms. Moore, what about the employees, the innocent people who lost their jobs?" I turned. The reporter was young, earnest. She reminded me of myself before all of this. "Halberton employed 3,000 people," I said. "But it destroyed thousands more. Small businesses Richard crushed, inventors whose patents he stole, families ruined by his fraudulent schemes. Those innocents never got justice. Today, they do." "But you profited from this," another reporter shouted. "Your shares," I laughed. "My shares are worthless. Halberton is worthless. That was always the plan." They looked confused. The idea that someone would destroy millions in value, including their own holdings, for something other than profit was incomprehensible to them. Wednesday afternoon, I visited Richard in federal detention. He sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit, his hair disheveled, his empire reduced to a metal table between us. "Come to gloat?" His voice was hollow. "Come to deliver something." I placed a photo on the table, my father in his garage workshop, smiling over his computer. Daniel Moore, brilliant engineer, loving father, the man whose life's work you stole to build your empire. Richard stared at the photo. "I don't even remember him." "I know. That's what made it worse. He was nothing to you. A stepping stone you crushed without thought." "So this was all revenge? You destroyed a $200 million company for revenge?" "No," I said. I destroyed it for justice. The courts failed my father. The system failed him. But the market is pure. It rewards value and punishes fraud. If given the truth, I just provided the truth. Richard leaned back. You're insane. You killed your own career. No company will hire you after this. I don't need them to. I stood up. I kept one thing from my father's work, his original code, the algorithm you stole. While you were building your house of cards, I was refining his vision. Next month, I'm launching More Technologies 2.0. We already have venture funding. His face went pale. You planned that too? Every detail. While you saw me as the pathetic 2% shareholder, I was building my future on the ashes of yours. The investors will never trust you. Not after this. Actually, they're lining up. Turns out, taking down a corrupt CEO with nothing but a 2% stake and determination is excellent marketing. They see me as incorruptible, unstoppable. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. You were right about one thing, Richard. 2% doesn't make you a player in the game. But sometimes, the game isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about making sure the right person loses. The guard opened the door. As I walked out, I heard Richard call after me. This won't bring your father back. I didn't turn around. He was right. Of course. Nothing would bring my father back. But somewhere. Maybe he was watching. Maybe he saw his daughter stand in the ruins of his enemy's empire, holding the blueprint for something better. The Halberton building stood empty against the Chicago skyline, its lights going out floor by floor. Soon it would be sold, renamed, repurposed. Richard Cole's name would be scrubbed from corporate history, mentioned only in cautionary tales about hubris and fraud. But Daniel Moore's name would live on, not as a victim, but as the inspiration for the technology company that would rise from Halberton's ashes. Justice served cold, with a side of 2% stake. The final shareholders' meeting took place in a modest conference room at the Marriott, a far cry from Halberton's opulent boardroom. 17 people attended, the remnants of a once mighty corporation. The marble table had been sold at auction, the leather chairs liquidated. We sat on standard hotel furniture, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. I arrived precisely at 10, taking my seat at the table's center. My 2% stake, worthless in monetary terms, still gave me the right to be here, to deliver the eulogy. Margaret Zhao called the meeting to order, her voice mechanical. We're here to formally dissolve Halberton Dynamics and distribute remaining assets after creditor claims. The number was pathetic. $3.2 million to be divided among shareholders. For my 2%, I would receive $64,000, less than my annual salary had been. Several major shareholders who'd owned millions in stock would walk away with nothing after legal fees. Before we vote, I said, standing, I have something to say. The room turned to me with expressions ranging from curiosity to hatred. These people had lost fortunes because of my campaign. 6 months ago, in the old boardroom, Richard Cole said 2% meant nothing. He said it made me an ant in the colony, a spectator with a slightly better seat. I looked at each face. He was wrong. 2% was everything, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. A voice, a right to demand truth. You destroyed us, Harold Kingston muttered. He'd owned 8%. Worth $16 million at Halberton's peak. No, Richard destroyed you. I just pulled back the curtain. Every fraudulent deal, every cooked book, every crime, that was all him. You chose to look away as long as the stock price climbed. So this was your noble crusade? Margaret asked bitterly. You're the hero of this story? There are no heroes here, just consequences. Richard stole from my father and built an empire on theft. You all benefited from that empire. Now it's gone, and you want someone to blame. Fine. Blame me. But know this. I did what the SEC should have done, what the board should have done, what any one of you could have done if you'd chosen integrity over income. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. The motion to dissolve Halberton Dynamics. I vote yes with my 2%. One by one, the others voted. All yes. What else could they do? The company was a corpse. After the vote, as people filed out, Margaret approached me. Was it worth it, Rebecca? Really? You've made powerful enemies. I've made something else too, I replied. A reputation. More technologies launched yesterday. We already have 3 major contracts. Her eyes widened. You used this entire thing as a launching pad? I used the truth as a launching pad. Richard's corruption was just the fuel. Outside, reporters waited. I stood before the microphones, the Chicago wind whipping my hair, and delivered my prepared statement. Today, Halberton Dynamics officially ceased to exist. A company built on theft, maintained by fraud, has returned to the nothing it always was. Let this be a lesson to every CEO who thinks they're untouchable, every board that chooses complicity over oversight, every system that protects the powerful at the expense of the principled. Ms. Moore, a reporter called out. What's next for you? I'm going to build the company my father should have built, ethically, transparently, successfully. And Richard Cole? Richard Cole is facing 25 years in federal prison. His assets are frozen. His reputation is destroyed. His name will forever be synonymous with corporate corruption. I paused. He should consider himself lucky. My father got a death sentence for trusting him. Richard just gets to live with his shame. That evening, I stood in my empty office at Halberton one last time. Maintenance had already removed my nameplate. The walls showed pale rectangles where my credentials had hung. I placed a single item on the bare desk, my father's original notebook, open to his first sketch of the compression algorithm. Below it, I wrote, Daniel Moore's work began here. Rebecca Moore's work begins now. Marcus found me there, champagne in hand. To the woman who brought down a giant with 2%. To the beginning, I corrected, taking a glass. This was just the demolition. Now comes construction. We toasted in the empty office, the city lights sparkling below. Somewhere in federal detention, Richard Cole sat in a cell, his empire reduced to concrete walls. Somewhere in heaven. Perhaps my father finally rested. You know they'll come after you, Marcus warned. Richard's allies, other CEOs who see you as a threat. Let them come. They think 2% taught me about destruction. They're wrong. It taught me about leverage, about patience, about the power of truth strategically deployed. I finished my champagne and set down the glass. Besides, I won't have 2% in my own company. I'll have 51. Marcus laughed. Control. Absolute control. The kind that means never having to sit through another man's mockery while he destroys everything you love. The lights went out in the Halberton building for the final time. I walked out without looking back. My father's notebook under my arm, my future ahead of me, and the sweet taste of justice still on my lips. 2%, just enough to change everything. 6 months later, I drove through the streets of Chicago one last time. The Lexus purred beneath me, not ostentatious like Richard's Bentley had been, but solid, earned, mine. In the rearview mirror, the city's skyline reflected the setting sun, painting everything gold. The former Halberton building had been renamed Millennium Center. Good. Let that name be erased. My phone buzzed. Marcus. The verdict just came in. I pulled over, heart steady. And? Guilty on all counts. 27 years, no possibility of parole for 15. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. It was over. Truly over. Rebecca, you there? I'm here, just processing. He asked to make a statement, said you were a cancer that destroyed American business innovation. The judge told him to sit down. I actually smiled. Even now, Richard couldn't admit fault, couldn't see that his own greed had been the cancer. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. Thank you for giving me the chance to matter again. More technology still needs a chief legal counsel, you know. The offer stands whenever you're ready. I hung up and continued driving. The interstate stretched ahead, leading away from Chicago, away from the ghosts. My car was packed with just the essentials. The new Moore Technologies headquarters in Austin awaited, a fresh start in a city that rewarded innovation over inheritance. At the city limits, I stopped at a rest area. Other travelers moved past, absorbed in their own journeys, oblivious to mine. I walked to a bench overlooking a small patch of prairie grass bending in the wind. From my jacket, I pulled out 2 items: my father's notebook and my Halberton employee ID. The notebook went back in my pocket. That stayed with me always. The ID card, with its photo of a woman who'd believed she needed to work within the system to change it. I held up to the dying light. Rebecca Moore, Senior Financial Analyst, Halberton Dynamics, 2% shareholder. I left it on the bench and walked back to my car. The highway unfolded ahead, straight and clear. In Austin, 32 employees were already working on my father's vision reimagined. The compression algorithm had evolved, improved, become something even he couldn't have imagined. We had patents filed properly, contracts signed ethically, and a board that understood fiduciary duty meant more than personal profit. My phone buzzed with interview requests, speaking engagements, a book deal. The business world wanted to understand how someone with 2% had toppled a titan. They wanted the secret, the strategy, the replicable formula. They'd never understand it wasn't about the percentage. It was about the principle, about a daughter's promise to a broken father, about justice delayed but not denied, about the power that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. As I merged onto I-65 South, Chicago disappeared completely from my mirrors. Somewhere behind me, Richard Cole sat in a federal cell, perhaps finally understanding that mockery has a price, that karma keeps perfect books, that 2% of something real is worth more than 100% of something stolen. My father used to say that code was poetry, structured, purposeful, beautiful in its logic. He never got to see his poem completed. But I had. With patience as my syntax and justice as my function, I'd written an ending he would have appreciated. The road stretched endlessly forward. In my pocket, his notebook pressed warm against my side. In my heart, finally, peace. I pressed the accelerator, my Lexus eating miles, carrying me toward tomorrow. Behind me, the wreckage of Halberton Dynamics and Richard Cole's empire settled into history. A cautionary tale about hubris and the dangerous mistake of underestimating someone with only 2%. 2% and everything to prove. 2% and a father to avenge. 2% and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Just 2%. But it was enough. It was always going to be enough. The sun set completely as I crossed into Indiana. I turned on the radio, finding a jazz station playing something smooth and triumphant. My father had loved jazz, the improvisation within structure, the way a single note could change everything if played at the right moment. I'd played my note. The symphony was complete. And Richard Cole? He'd have 27 years of silence to remember the sound of laughter in that boardroom when he'd mocked my tiny stake. 27 years to realize that he'd been laughing at his own executioner. I smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in 2 years. Then I drove on into the darkness, toward the dawn of something new, something clean, something entirely mine. The girl with 2% had won everything by being willing to lose it all. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and justice served cold. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story of how 2% brought down a 200mm empire resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Rebecca's position? Let me know in the comments.